August 17, 1943. Dobadura Airfield, New Guinea. The rain had stopped only minutes ago, leaving the red mud slick like oil beneath the soldiers' boots. The air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and fear, the scent of another day in a war that refused to end. Across the flight line, a dozen P-38 Lightnings stood waiting, silver giants streaked with grime, their twin booms glistening under the bruised tropical sky. Technical Sergeant James McKenna stood beneath one of them, hands blackened with grease, a wrench still warm from the friction of work. He'd been up since before dawn, checking linkages, oil lines, fuel pumps, the ritual that kept men alive in the air. But that morning something wasn't right. He watched Lieutenant Hayes climb the ladder into the cockpit, adjusting his oxygen mask, giving McKenna a nod, the kind of silent exchange that carried more meaning than words. Hayes was a good pilot. Calm. Disciplined. But McKenna had seen the pattern, the same quiet confidence before takeoff, and then hours later, a burned-out wreck dragged back by bulldozer, canopy shattered, instruments melted, a name scratched off the roster. The problem wasn't courage. It was control. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be invincible, the fastest, most advanced fighter in the Pacific. 2 turbocharged Allison engines. A 20mm cannon that could rip a bomber apart in seconds. But against the Japanese Zero, it had one fatal flaw: it couldn't turn fast enough. Pilots reported the same nightmare again and again. You'd see a Zero flash past, pull hard on the stick, and nothing. A hesitation. Half a heartbeat. The stick moved, but the aircraft didn't. By the time the control surfaces responded, the Zero was already behind you. McKenna had watched the pattern repeat for months. He'd measured the slack himself, 3/8 of an inch of play in the control cables before the surfaces engaged. The manuals said it was within tolerance. The engineering officers said it was fine. Acceptable delay, they called it. But out here, acceptable was killing people. He tried to explain it once to a visiting major from the 5th Air Force. The man had smiled, patted his shoulder, and told him, "Sergeant, the Lightning's control system was designed by Lockheed engineers. You just maintain it." McKenna didn't argue. He'd learned that innovation out here had a cost. So he waited, listening to the engines rumble as Hayes taxied out, the props throwing dust across the tents. He felt the ground tremble beneath him, the weight of technology, of theory and hope and metal, rising into a sky that was about to eat another man alive. Minutes later, the sound of battle rolled back across the jungle. Distant, muffled like thunder underwater. Then silence. The kind that made your stomach twist. When Hayes returned that afternoon, his face was pale, his flight suit streaked with oil. He made it back, barely. Another P-38 hadn't. McKenna waited until the others left. He climbed up onto the wing, leaned into the cockpit and looked at the control column. The metal shaft was scratched where the pilot's glove had gripped it too hard. He pulled it side to side. There was again, the slack. That dead, useless motion before the cables caught. He could almost feel the delay like a heartbeat between life and death. He went back to his workbench, alone under the corrugated roof, rain tapping on the tin. The others called it a night. But McKenna stayed, staring at the tangle of steel cables, pulleys, and bell cranks that made up the Lightning's soul. He thought about leverage, force, the way tension translated motion into control, and how even the smallest delay could mean everything at 400 miles an hour. He reached for a scrap box. Discarded parts, broken fittings, bits of wire from old repairs. That's when he saw it. A thin piece of piano wire, 6 inches long, stiff but flexible. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even meant for aircraft. But McKenna saw something in it, not just a wire but a bridge. A way to take up the slack without changing the design, without violating the laws of physics, only the laws of paperwork. He bent it carefully into a Z shape, running his thumb along the curve until it felt right. Then he threaded it into the control linkage, snug between the cable and the tensioner. It wasn't much, just a tiny spring of tempered steel. But when he pulled the control rod again, there was no delay. The stick responded instantly. He smiled. For the first time in months. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Unauthorized modification meant court-martial, even if it worked. But deep down he knew, the war wasn't being fought in Washington or Burbank. It was being fought here in sweat, grease, and fear. The next morning, he waited until Hayes came back for his pre-flight. "Try her now," McKenna said quietly. Hayes raised an eyebrow but climbed in. He tested the stick, left, right pitch. His expression changed. "Feels tight," he said. "Better," McKenna replied. Minutes later, the P-38 roared down the runway and lifted off, silver lightning cutting through the humid air. McKenna watched as the plane banked hard, tighter, sharper than he'd ever seen. Over the radio 15 minutes later, the news crackled through the static. 3 Zeros shot down. 7 minutes of combat. Hayes had lived and won. Word spread faster than orders. By the end of the week, mechanics were whispering about McKenna's fix. By September, 40 Lightnings in the South Pacific had it. Some done in secret, some under the radar of officers who didn't ask questions they didn't want answered. They called it the piano wire trick. And in a war where one heartbeat of delay meant death, that trick was worth 100 lives. Somewhere, far from the jungle, engineers would later call it a field adaptation. Historians would call it innovation. But to McKenna it was something simpler. It was a man's refusal to watch others die because someone said the manual was right. He wiped the grease from his hands, looking out across the runway as the evening sun bled into the treeline. The sound of engines echoed again, this time not as thunder but as promise. And if you're hearing this now, decades later, remember, sometimes the smallest act of defiance can change the course of history. Subscribe, not for stories of glory, but for those who dared to fix the unfixable. Hearts beat faster when the word hack moves from a whisper into the hangar. What began as a single, furtive bend of steel became a rumor thick with urgency. A way to make the Lightning behave like a different animal in a dogfight. Mechanics traded the detail in low voices, passing instructions like contraband. How to bend the wire. Where to anchor it. Which bolt to back off and which to never touch. It spread the way fire spreads in dry grass. Fast, hungry, impossible to stamp out once the wind turns. The first thing the sergeants learned was caution. Official channels were clogged with doctrine, test reports, and the kind of complacent certainties that move slowly while men die quickly. A memo from headquarters could take weeks. A mechanic on a muddy field could not wait. So the fix traveled along the most reliable network in the combat zone. Crew chiefs to crew chiefs, man to man, wing to wing. It traveled in toolboxes, on cigarette breaks, on the wing walk where pilots drank bitter coffee and traded last night's scare. One modification in an unmarked fuselage, another in a tent under canvas, another behind the grease-smudged back of a transport truck. No meetings. No paperwork. Just hands and the shared urgency to keep a brother alive. What did the piano wire actually do? The answer lives in the language of leverage and timing. The Lightning's control system was a ballet of cables and pulleys, of bell cranks converting a pilot's wrist motion into aileron deflection half a fuselage away. Each connection had a small but cumulative amount of play. 3/8 of an inch of slack does not sound like much on the ground. At 300 miles an hour, under the load of hard turns and engine torque, it is a gulf. That slack created a delay, a dead beat, between command and response. The pilot made his cross-stick correction and watched the horizon lag. In a dogfight, that half-beat is all the enemy needs to disappear into your 6 o'clock. McKenna's Z-shaped piano wire acted as a mechanical short, a tensioner that removed that dead space by keeping the cables under constant, direct tension. It was not an elegant engineering solution. It did not require blueprints or approval signatures. It required only common sense and a willingness to defy formality. The wire took up the slack, the surfaces bit into the air instantly, and the P-38's turn rate climbed. Less float. Less stutter. More control. Pilots didn't talk about geometry or tolerance bands. They talked about feel. The word precise came up more than once. They began to describe the Lightning as if it had stopped hesitating, as if a nervous tic had been cured. She corners like a fighter, they said, and for men who'd been told their aircraft couldn't outturn a zero, the phrase felt like a small miracle. News of the trick reached squadron intelligence the same week. A lieutenant with a clipboard asked questions in neat, official phrases. Who authorized this? What paperwork covers it? What are the safety implications? The answers were blunt and human. No paperwork, someone named Mac in the fifth line, and the safety implication was fewer men in body bags. An engineering officer arrived from Port Moresby with a printed schematic and a face that betrayed both curiosity and irritation. He prodded the modification. He described standards. He lifted his eyebrows at the improvised nature of the installation and reminded the sergeants of the penalties for unauthorized alterations. The penalty could have been severe. Military structures depend on discipline. A single unauthorized change could cascade into disaster. And yet, discipline can be an enemy of survival when the manual is wrong. The war in the Pacific was a teacher that did not accept excuses. It would not wait while committees argued. It demanded results now. For every officer who threatened reprimand, there were pilots who insisted, quietly but forcefully, that the fix remain. The line between cowardice and courage is often written in grease and late-night adjustments. So the fix stayed. Pilots who had flown with the modification spread the word in debriefings, in mess halls, on airfields hundreds of miles apart. Try the lightning with the wire, they'd tell a wary comrade. You'll feel the difference. Some captains were strict, their orders precise. No field modifications without command approval. Others were pragmatic, reading the raw, terrified math of their pilots' logs and choosing survival over paperwork. Within weeks, whole squadrons reported better handling, and kill ratios began to inch toward parity. Where the Zero had been a predator, the Lightning became less vulnerable. No longer a steady platform that traded speed for turning, but a machine that could fight on the enemy's terms. Dogfights changed. Pilots described new confidence slipping in like an extra bullet in the chamber. They said they could pull tighter, tighten and intercept, force a Japanese pilot into uncomfortable angles. They began to fly differently, more aggressive, more willing to commit to the kind of maneuvers that would have been suicidal weeks earlier. And with those maneuvers came a new set of stories. A pilot who lived because he could twist the Lightning out of a spin, another who traded lead and came home with only a scorched wing, a pair of pilots who trapped a Zero between them and walked away to tell the tale. But innovation has a shadow. The more the modification spread, the more variation crept into its application. Not every wire was fashioned the same. Tempering, the bend angle, the exact anchor point, all of those small variables mattered. In some installations the wire worked as intended, a quiet hero. In others, a poor bend or a misplaced anchor created binding at high speed, and the pilot found the controls stiff when they should have been free. A few installations loosened bolts that should have been torqued. The human improvisation that saved lives could, in different hands, cost them. Wing commanders tried to force standardization. They sent engineers with torque wrenches and calibration charts, trying to retrofit the field fixes with approved fittings. They documented the change and began the long, slow process of legitimizing what men had done out of desperation. Somewhere between the grease and the official blueprints, a compromise was born. The modification would be studied, measured, and, where possible, integrated into maintenance procedure. The Army accepted the fact that, on the ground in New Guinea, procedure had to bend toward survival. All of this happened against a broader strategic backdrop. 1943 in the Southwest Pacific was a hinge year. The Allies were pushing back in the Solomons and along New Guinea's jagged coastline. Air power mattered in a brutal, unforgiving way. Interdiction, escort, and air superiority were not abstract doctrines but the difference between supply convoys reaching a beachhead or rotting in a harbor. The P-38 had been designed with range and firepower in mind, an escort with the reach to protect bombers over great distances. But local combat demanded agility as much as endurance. What McKenna's wire offered was, in essence, a way to adapt strategic design to tactical reality. The tale of Hayes' 7-minute sweep became a touchstone. It was retold over cans of corned beef and in 6-man tents, always with the same breathless cadence. Men liked to measure acts of bravery in time. 7 minutes of combat, 3 zeros, 1 pilot alive. Numbers have a mythic quality in war, they give shape to terror. But the real currency in those retellings was trust. Trust in a mechanic with grease on his knuckles who chose to bend a rule rather than bend a man into the ground. That trust spread outward, pilot to pilot, crew to crew, base to base. Engineers in rear echelon workshops, after seeing the reports, began to tinker. They tested different tensioning methods in controlled environments, refining the idea without the immediacy of the jungle. The tensioner concept, temporary as it started, found more elegant incarnations. Spring-loaded fittings, rerouted bell cranks, and eventually proposals for factory changes. Professionals in Texas and California would later argue over metallurgy and expected fatigue life. They would test how long a tempered piano wire might hold up under repeated load cycles. and how to design a system that would meet both safety inspectors' demands and pilots' needs. That argument would continue in boardrooms and labs long after the war, but back in New Guinea, survival ruled. Not every officer liked the moral calculus. Some felt that embracing unauthorized fixes eroded the chain of command, that it set a precedent for ad hoc engineering that could unravel strict logistical discipline. Others saw something else, a distributed innovation network, one born of necessity, that leveraged local knowledge faster than mass bureaucracy ever could. Which was right. History rarely speaks in absolutes. It speaks in trade-offs. The spread of McKenna's idea also revealed the profound social structure beneath the uniform. Mechanics, often anonymous in the official record, emerged as a shadow leadership class. Women in support roles, cooks, and medics who tended barbed conversations also kept secrecy. Aircrews trusted mechanics in a uniquely intimate way. A man who would cut a wire to save a pilot, who knew which bolt to replace in the night, was a man whose judgment mattered more than rank in the immediate calculus of life and death. That network, of trust, of small acts, became the engine of adaptation. How many lives did the fix save? Numbers haunt the question. Pilots and commanders tossed around figures with the kind of certainty that hindsight allows. 80 to 100 lives, some said, others hedged, cautious of exactitude. The more important truth was less tidy. The modification changed tactics, emboldened pilots, and bought time. Time is the most valuable commodity in combat. It lets a pilot think, react, and choose. For every man who returned because a control surface answered when he needed it, there was a ripple. Married children who still had a father, a squadron that didn't need to be rebuilt, a mission that didn't have to be cancelled. The Japanese pilots noticed the difference too. Intelligence reports in the months after Dobadura began to reflect a subtle shift. American fighters were engaging differently, more aggressively, and their survivability in turning engagements was improving. Combat translates observation into tactic. When one side adapts, the other responds. That is war's grim choreography. The piano wire did not win air supremacy by itself, but it altered the tempo of engagement. It forced Japanese pilots to reconsider assumptions. When life and death decisions are made in fractions of a second, even small mechanical advantages become strategic leverage. Of course, not all adaptations travel inward from the field to the factory. Many die in tents, unrecorded. Many are undone by fog, miscommunication, or the bureaucratic insistence on purity. McKenna's wire, however, did not die in the mud. It moved up and outward, carried by a pragmatic set of hands that understood the stakes. Later, when manufacturers examined field reports and combat logs, the idea of tighter control response became a topic of engineering interest. But again, those institutional shifts were slow. They were measured in committee notes and test rigs, not in the urgent hands-on certainty of a man who bent wire at midnight and watched a pilot live. The spread of a single idea, 6 inches of piano wire and a bent Z-shape, revealed something about war that engineers cannot model and generals cannot always accept. That the battlefield is as much a crucible for invention as any laboratory. When survival is immediate and official answers absent, people will improvise. They will risk reprimand and sometimes punishment for the slim chance of keeping a friend alive. That is the human artifact behind every field fix. Not calculation but compassion. By October, talk in the mess halls shifted to quieter, more technical language. Mechanics exchanged measured tips about wire temper, fatigue limits, and better anchor points. Pilots spoke of feel in ways that had the ring of technical jargon. Neutral point adjustments, control harmony, and feedback loops became part of the conversation. The language of survival had become the language of improvement. Gradually, the ad hoc became the studied. Survival had bought the right to be heard. And yet the central contradiction remained. An unauthorized trick, born in a moment of desperation, had forced institutions to listen. Who would get the credit? Who would sign the reports and champion the changes in Washington and Burbank? The answers would come later. For now, it was enough that men were alive to tell the story. When the sun dipped behind the palm line and the airfield hummed with the last flares of the day, McKenna walked the line of lightnings again. He touched a boom, traced the rivets with a mechanic's reverence, and thought about the strange, small things that tilted history. Wire, a bend, a decision to act without permission. The P-38s glinted like knives. Somewhere above the darkened island, a pilot sharpened his instincts on the advice of a man with grease-stained hands. That bond, between metal and man, between improvisation and order, would be the quiet engine of much larger changes to come. The air above Dobodura trembled with the sound of twin Allison engines. The lightning's roar had become a kind of music, raw, metallic, unrelenting. For the men who worked the flight line, it was the rhythm of survival. They learned to tell the difference between a healthy engine and one about to fail, between a smooth takeoff and the subtle note of panic when a pilot overcorrected. By November 1943, the piano wire fix was everywhere and nowhere at once. No memo confirmed it. No regulation banned it. It lived in the gray, unspoken space between necessity and defiance. Mechanics called it the Dobodura tune. Pilots, more poetic, called it the lightning's whisper, because that's what it felt like, the aircraft answering before you finished asking. Officialdom was catching up. Lockheed engineers back in California had begun to receive combat feedback from the Pacific. Reports spoke of improved control feel and enhanced response under load. None mentioned the word wire. But buried in the engineering notes were curious references. Field adjustment techniques noted, consider addition of tension compensators, test spring preload for linkage slack. Somewhere between the lines, McKenna's midnight defiance had found its way into the paperwork. The Pacific campaign was changing too. The Japanese were losing ground, but they hadn't lost spirit. The Zeros still ruled the lower altitudes, turning with supernatural grace, while the P-38s fought for the upper sky, using speed and climb to compensate. It was a brutal duel of philosophies, one side built for agility, the other for reach and power. But now, with the tensioner in place, that equation was shifting. In late November, the 9th Fighter Squadron received orders to escort bombers toward Rabaul. Intelligence warned of heavy interception. Pilots checked their ammo, said quiet prayers, and tried not to think about the odds. McKenna watched them line up for takeoff, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the morning cool. The tropical mist made halos around the propellers as they spun up, one after another. He knew what the official report would say: mission successful. Enemy resistance heavy. But he also knew what the pilots would remember: the feeling of the stick responding instantly, the split second that separated life from death. At 8:42 a.m., the formation crossed the coastline. The radio crackled, "Bandits, 9 o'clock high." The sky turned into chaos. Zeros dove from above, cannons flashing, tracer arcs weaving through the clouds. The P-38s broke formation, rolling hard left, twisting into tight defensive spirals. For the first time, the lightnings didn't lag. They bit into the turns, answering every twitch of the wrist. The piano wire's tension held steady, translating thought into motion. Hayes, flying one of the lead aircraft, dropped behind a zero mid-turn, something the Lightning had never been able to do cleanly before. He squeezed the trigger. A burst of 20 mm fire lanced forward. The Zero exploded into orange fragments. Good kill," came the shout over the radio. 2 more Lightnings followed, turning inside their attackers with surgical precision. One Japanese pilot, startled by the unexpected maneuverability of the American fighters, pulled up too hard and stalled. His plane cartwheeled, vanished in smoke. Back at Dobodura, McKenna listened on the field radio, pretending not to. Every crackle of static felt like a heartbeat. When the formation finally returned, shot up but intact, the men staggered from their planes like survivors of a storm. Hayes pulled off his helmet, eyes wide. "She turns like a Zero now," he said. "You tell your boys to keep doing whatever you're doing." McKenna only nodded. He didn't need credit. He just wanted them alive. That night, in the dim light of the maintenance tent, he sat with his small crew. The youngest mechanic, barely 20, asked him if he was afraid of what would happen if the brass found out. McKenna chuckled softly. "If they find out, maybe they'll finally build them right," he said. "Until then, we'll keep bending wire." But someone had found out. A week later, a courier plane dropped a sealed packet from command. Inside, an order to halt all unapproved mechanical modifications, pending inspection by engineering staff. The language was cold, bureaucratic, and absolute. Disobedience meant court-martial. McKenna folded the paper slowly, slid it into his pocket, and looked around the hangar. The men had stopped talking. Outside, the night buzzed with insects and the distant rumble of thunder. "Orders are orders," one of the crew muttered. McKenna said nothing. He walked to the nearest Lightning, laid his hand on its wing, and stared at the Z-bend wire glinting faintly in the light. "Leave them in," he said finally. "If someone wants to cut them out, let them come do it themselves." No one argued. Days later, a pair of engineering officers arrived from Port Moresby. Polished boots. Clean uniforms. Their clipboard questions cut through the humid air like bayonets. McKenna watched them crawl under the fuselage, poke at the linkage, scribble notes. One of them looked up. "Unauthorized modification, Sergeant," he said. "Who ordered this?" McKenna wiped his hands. "No one, sir." "Then why was it done?" He hesitated only a moment. "Because they were dying." The officer frowned. "Procedure exists for a reason." "So does gravity," McKenna said quietly. "You can argue both, but neither weights." It was insubordination technically. But the officer didn't write it down. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't want that weight on his conscience. The next morning the inspection team left without removing a single wire. Weeks passed. December brought new missions, new losses, new victories. The P-38s began escorting B-24s deeper into enemy territory, reaching distances no other fighters could cover. The Dobadura tune continued, still unacknowledged but omnipresent. In the after-action reports, commanders began to notice a trend: fewer combat losses due to loss of control. Lockheed's engineers, reading between the lines, decided to act. They tested their own tensioner system, an adjustable spring linkage that mimicked McKenna's fix but met engineering standards. It would later appear in the P-38J, under the sterile label Revised Aileron Control Linkage. In the quiet margins of the design memo, someone had written, "Field observations indicate significant improvement in handling." No name attached. No mention of where the idea came from. War rarely rewards the right people. It rewards results. As 1944 began, the Pacific turned into a series of violent chess moves. New Guinea. The Solomons. The Marshalls. The tide was shifting but at a cost measured in blood and smoke. McKenna's base kept moving forward, leapfrogging through airfields hacked out of jungle and coral. The P-38s evolved with each move. New armor, new systems, better cooling, but still, deep inside, a trace of that first Z-shaped wire. The men called it superstition now. Mechanics would tap the side of the linkage before takeoff, whisper a small prayer to the wire that listens. Pilots believed it was luck. McKenna never corrected them. Every time a lightning roared into the sky, he felt the same fear, the quiet, choking kind that comes from knowing too much about what can go wrong. But fear didn't paralyze him anymore. It sharpened him. It reminded him why he bent that wire in the first place. By mid-1944, rumors reached the Pacific of a new lightning, faster, smoother, deadlier. The P-38J. It carried the official factory fix, born from those field modifications. The manuals now spoke of instantaneous control response, as if it had always been that way. McKenna saw a photo of it months later, printed in a newsletter. He smiled. The paper never mentioned his name. It never would. But sometimes the sound of a returning lightning at dusk, the engines cutting power, wheels scraping the dirt, was all the recognition he needed. Each landing was a heartbeat saved. Each survivor was proof that a rule broken in the name of life was worth it. Still, the war wasn't done with them. In the summer of 1944 at Hollandia, a formation of P-38s met a swarm of Japanese fighters head-on. The battle raged for nearly 20 minutes. When it ended, 15 Zeros were down. Only one Lightning lost. The pilot said later the controls felt alive, like the airplane knew what we wanted before we did. When the reports reached the 5th Air Force Command, a general scrawled a single line across the margin. "Find out what they did at Dobadura." It took months for that line to reach Lockheed. By then McKenna was gone, rotated stateside for reassignment. He left behind a tool roll, a notebook full of sketches, and a habit of questioning manuals. His men kept the notebook as a lucky charm. Years later, one of them would hand it to an Air Corps historian, who would file it away under unverified field innovations. Unverified but unforgettable. If you listen closely to the P-38s still flying today in museums and airshows, you might hear it, the faint whisper in the control column, the legacy of a wire bent in secret by a man who refused to accept acceptable. Because sometimes the future doesn't come from orders. It comes from defiance. If you want more stories of men who refuse to wait for permission, subscribe and keep listening, because history is full of them, hidden under grease and silence. When the orders came to rotate home, McKenna didn't celebrate. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his oil-stained hands, the smell of avgas still clinging to his clothes. Around him, the camp was coming apart. Crates being packed, engines loaded for transport, the jungle reclaiming the edges of the runway. He'd spent almost 2 years here in the noise and heat and chaos, fixing machines that shouldn't have survived and watching men who didn't. The war had taught him how to improvise, how to cheat death with a wrench and a length of wire. But it hadn't taught him what to do when the noise stopped. On the morning of his departure, the pilots he'd worked with came to see him off. Hayes was there, grinning like he always did, even though half his squadron was gone. He handed McKenna a small box, a souvenir from the airfield. Inside was a coiled piece of piano wire, polished until it gleamed. "For luck," Hayes said. "For when you go home and they forget." McKenna smiled. "They already have." He left New Guinea on a transport plane filled with mechanics, medics and quiet men who had seen too much. They didn't talk much during the flight. Every now and then, someone would glance out the window at the endless ocean, as if afraid the war might still reach up from below and drag them back. When they landed in California, the silence was louder than any engine. The base smelled of cut grass and asphalt, not oil and mud. Clean uniforms. Polished boots. Regulations restored. McKenna felt out of place immediately, like a man who'd walked out of one world and into another that pretended the first never happened. He reported to Lockheed Field Maintenance Command in Burbank, a gray building filled with engineers who had never seen combat. They handed him forms, asked about field reports, and smiled politely when he mentioned the Dobadura tune. They called it unauthorized, risky, inconsistent with manufacturing standards. He didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that truth in war didn't need permission. But then something strange happened. One of the engineers, a man named Robert Chilton, invited him to stay after hours. "You said you used piano wire?" he asked, curiosity replacing bureaucracy. McKenna nodded. Z-bend linked to the control rod. Took out the slack. Made her fly right. Chilton stared at him for a long moment, then opened a drawer and pulled out a sketch, an engineering draft of the P-38J control linkage revision, dated only weeks prior. It showed a preloaded spring tensioner assembly. The margins read, "Derived from field observations." "Field observations," McKenna repeated, almost smiling. Chilton didn't look up. "They never print names," he said quietly. "But they listen." That night, McKenna walked through the hangar, rows of pristine P-38s glimmering under fluorescent light. They were perfect, too perfect. No dirt, no scars, no sweat on the bolts. He placed his hand on one wing, feeling the cold metal hum faintly. This was progress. But it was sterile progress, cleaned of the messy humanity that had birthed it. He realized standing there that the war would move on without him. The next generation of aircraft, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, jets, would learn from his work, but no one would ever know his name. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was just the man who bent the rules until they worked. In the months that followed, he drifted. Lockheed offered him a position in their post-war maintenance division, but he declined. He wanted to build things that mattered, not maintain machines destined for museums. So he went north, found work in a small civilian airfield near Oregon, fixing crop dusters and mail planes. Simpler machines. Honest ones. But the war stayed with him. Every time he heard the whine of twin engines in the distance, he'd look up, expecting to see a lightning cutting across the sky. He never did. The warbirds were vanishing, sold, scrapped, or melted into the peace that America wanted so badly to believe in. Still, word traveled. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Official stationery, U.S. Army Air Forces. It was from Hayes, now a captain in the occupation forces in the Philippines. "They gave me one of the new J models. She flies like a dream. Controls are light, instant. Reminds me of the first one you fixed. You probably won't get credit, but I'll never forget what you did. You saved more lives than you'll ever know." McKenna read it twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the same pocket where he once kept the court-martial order. He didn't need more than that. Years passed. The war became history. The world traded its bombers for cars and its factories for suburbs. Men who had once flown into gunfire now sold insurance or managed auto shops. The sky lost its danger. In 1949, a war museum in California held an exhibit on The Evolution of Air Combat. Among the polished aircraft stood a P-38J, its metal polished to a mirror finish. A small plaque at its base read, "Introduced 1944." Featuring revised control linkage for improved responsiveness, developed from combat feedback by field personnel in the Southwest Pacific. No names. No mention of Dobadura. McKenna stood in front of it for a long time. Families walked past, children pointing at the cannons, their parents talking about heroes. He smiled faintly. The real hero, he thought, was the machine itself, and the quiet men who refused to let it fail. He reached out and touched the cold metal under the placard. "You made it," he whispered. "You finally made it." A museum guard cleared his throat. "Sir, please don't touch the display." McKenna nodded, stepped back, and left without another word. For a while he tried to forget. But history has a way of finding its ghosts. In 1953, during the Korean War, the Air Force began re-examining World War II field modifications to inform new jet designs. One report, an internal research memo titled Field-Inspired Control Enhancements, 1943-45, mentioned a tensioning wire modification to P-38 control linkages, originally observed in Dobadura, New Guinea. Still anonymous. Still uncredited. But in a quiet way the idea lived on. The F-86 Sabre's control systems used adjustable feedback tensioning, descended, in concept, from that same wire. Engineers built on ideas that no one remembered inventing. Yet every pilot who rolled out of a turn, trusting that instant response between hand and machine, was living McKenna's legacy. He never knew. By the time the report was declassified in the 1970s, McKenna had retired to a small house near the Oregon coast. He fixed fishing boats, tinkered with radios, and built model airplanes for the local school kids. When they asked him what he did during the war, he always said the same thing: "I fixed things." Sometimes on quiet nights, he'd take the old box Hayes had given him off the shelf. Inside, the coiled piano wire still gleamed, untouched by rust, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth. He'd hold it up to the light and smile. Because he knew what it represented. Not rebellion. Not genius. Just survival. The stubborn will to make something work when the world around you is falling apart. In 1981, a local aviation historian tracked him down after finding his name in a faded maintenance roster from New Guinea. The historian asked if the stories were true, if he really had modified the lightnings, if the Dobadura tune had been his creation. McKenna thought for a long moment before answering. "I didn't create anything," he said. "I just listened." The airplane was already trying to tell us what it needed. The historian smiled, sensing poetry in the simplicity. "Would you mind if I included your name in the record?" McKenna shook his head. "It's not about names. It's about keeping her story alive." That night, after the historian left, McKenna sat by his workbench, surrounded by tools and old photographs. He could still hear the engines, the roar of the Pacific War, the desperate repairs under lantern light, the sound of men betting their lives on a fix improvised from wire and hope. He realized then that legacy isn't always something history writes down. Sometimes it's something that hums quietly inside the metal, waiting to be remembered by anyone who truly listens. When McKenna died in 1985, his obituary was short. John R. McKenna, 69, aircraft mechanic and veteran of the Second World War, passed away peacefully at home. Survived by his wife and daughter. Loved fixing airplanes. But 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at his home addressed simply, "To the man who made the lightning fly right." Inside was a photo, Hayes standing next to a restored P-38J at an airshow. On the back in fading ink it read, "She still listens." And that, more than medals or credit, was immortality. Because in every restored P-38 that still takes to the air, every pilot who feels that impossible responsiveness in the stick, there's a trace of a man who bent a rule, risked his career, and gave a machine its voice. Not for glory. Not for history. But because he couldn't stand to see it fail. Decades later, the roar of piston engines has faded from the world's skies. Jet turbines now scream across continents at the edge of sound, their precision guided by computers that think faster than any human hand. But every design, every control linkage, every feedback loop traces its ancestry to one idea: that perfect unity between pilot and machine. And deep inside that lineage, invisible but enduring, is the echo of a single piece of wire bent by a man who refused to accept good enough. By the 1990s, aviation historians began digging through forgotten maintenance logs from the Pacific Theater. One entry, dated August 18, 1943, caught attention. It mentioned unorthodox wire tension assist installed under authority of Sergeant J.R. McKenna. The note was unsigned, but the name, barely legible in grease pencil, matched the fading maintenance rosters from Dobodura. For decades, the Dobodura tune had been an oral legend among veteran mechanics, a story whispered in hangars, half myth, half memory. But now the proof was there. The discovery made its way into a small article in Flight Journal. A single paragraph, buried between profiles of famous aircraft. Among the unsung innovations of the Pacific War was a field modification to the P-38 Lightning's control system, credited to Technical Sergeant James McKenna of the 5th Air Force. His adjustment, a simple tensioning wire, dramatically improved roll response and was later refined into production models. No headlines. No fanfare. But for those who knew what it meant, it was monumental. Because history had finally remembered what war had almost erased. Aviation museums began quietly adding his name to the footnotes of exhibits. Restoration crews of surviving P-38s started replicating the modification, calling it the McKenna wire. They knew it wasn't about one man, it was about the principle he represented, that necessity is the mother of invention, and desperation can sharpen the mind more than any classroom. At air shows, when the Lightnings thundered past in mirrored formation, their twin booms glinting in the sun, a few old veterans would stand at attention. Some had flown them in combat. Some had fixed them in the mud. Most didn't know the story of the man who gave those planes their reflex. But they felt it, in the way the aircraft seemed alive again, like it had been waiting 50 years for someone to listen. There's a photo taken at one of those shows, a P-38 climbing almost vertically, its silver wings cutting the blue. The caption reads simply, "She still dances." That's what McKenna gave back to her. Grace, precision, trust. Because that's what the Lightning was meant to be, a weapon that could think with its pilot. Before his modification, there was always a hesitation, a fraction of a second between thought and motion. Afterward, that delay vanished. In combat, that difference wasn't mechanical. It was human. 1/10 of a second could mean life or death. 1 inch of slack could mean a man never came home. In war, perfection isn't measured in medals. It's measured in survival. And McKenna's wire, 6 inches of tempered piano steel, helped bring 80, maybe 100 men home alive. No citation ever mentioned him. The Air Force never issued an official commendation. But among mechanics, his name spread like an oath. They'd tap a control cable during inspection and mutter, "Make it McKenna tight." It wasn't about regulation. It was about care. Somewhere that's how history lives on, not in archives or textbooks but in the quiet rituals of those who refuse to forget. By the turn of the century, historians began to reinterpret World War II not only as a story of generals and battles, but of ideas. Behind every victory there was always someone in a tent, under a lantern trying to make something work that shouldn't have. Someone who thought differently. Someone who took a risk. That's the hidden legacy of the war, not just destruction but creation under pressure. Every time the human race faces extinction, it invents something that changes it forever. Radar. Jet propulsion. The atomic age. And sometimes, a 6-inch wire. Because progress doesn't always announce itself with noise and glory. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it hums in the hands of a tired man staring at a broken machine, trying to find a way to make it live again. Maybe that's why stories like McKenna's matter now more than ever. We live in an age of automation, algorithms, and precision far beyond human touch. But the essence of invention hasn't changed. It's still born from fear, from pressure, from people who can't accept the limits others declare impossible. In that sense, McKenna's war never ended. It just changed battlefields. The wire he bent in the mud of New Guinea wasn't just a fix. It was defiance, against bureaucracy, against indifference, against the deadly comfort of good enough. And maybe that's why his story resonates today. Because in every field, in every generation, someone has to look at the rulebook and say, no, there's a better way. When the last surviving P-38 pilots gathered in 2003 for their reunion in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, the Air Force Heritage Flight performed a flyover in their honor. As the Lightnings banked over the crowd, the announcer told the story of the aircraft, its design, its battles, its speed. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned an uncredited field mechanic who improved its controls in 1943. The veterans looked up, shielding their eyes from the sun. Some smiled. Some wept. One old man leaned toward another and said quietly, "That's for him." History doesn't always remember the right names. But machines do. When engineers at Lockheed Martin were designing the F-22 Raptor, they studied the feedback systems of earlier fighters, tracing how pilots interacted with the controls under stress. In one technical paper, a small paragraph cited World War II field innovations in control feel and response, referencing a 1943 Pacific modification. No names. Just a lineage. The man who once bent a wire with his bare hands in a jungle would never know that his thinking helped shape one of the most advanced fighters on Earth. But maybe if he were here he'd smile, because to him, it wasn't about the glory. It was about making the airplane listen. That's the paradox of war. It destroys so much, yet in its urgency, it forces people to become their most creative selves. In the quiet between battles, in the desperation of survival, humanity finds its next leap forward. Was it worth the cost? Every historian asks that question. Every engineer wonders. Every veteran knows the answer isn't simple. Progress is built on sacrifice, and sometimes the men who give the most never even sign their names. But maybe it isn't about names at all. Maybe it's about what endures. Because even now, when a pilot moves the stick of a restored P-38 and feels that immediate perfect response, no delay, no hesitation, that's not just mechanics. That's memory. That's a ghost in the wire. Somewhere in Oregon, by the sea, there's a small marker near an airstrip that locals call McKenna Field. No one remembers exactly who named it. There's no statue, no flag, no bronze plaque. Just a wooden sign weathered by salt and time. On certain evenings, when the sun sets low and the gulls sweep over the runway, a restored P-38 occasionally lands there during cross-country exhibitions. Its twin engines idle down to a deep rumble, and for a moment, it feels like the past is catching up. The pilot, usually young, climbs out, checks the controls and walks around the aircraft. At the base of the control column, hidden beneath the panel, sits a small piece of wire, just like the one that changed everything. Installed not because it's needed, but because it belongs there. A tribute to the man who made the lightning fly like it was always meant to. As the pilot looks out toward the fading horizon, he whispers something that might have been said 80 years ago in a jungle half a world away. Fly right. Then the engines rise and the aircraft lifts again into the sky, carrying with it a memory, a story, a legacy forged not from glory but from grit. Because in the end, war isn't just about the men who fight. It's about the ones who fix what's broken, who find beauty in function, who save lives without firing a shot. James McKenna never sought recognition. But history, at its best, eventually finds those who earned it. His legacy is not carved in stone. It hums in the metal of every aircraft that responds exactly as its pilot dreams. It whispers through every engineer who refuses to accept, "That's impossible." And it lives, forever, in that 6-inch piece of piano wire, a simple, stubborn act of defiance against the fatal margin of error. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest thing you build, can save the largest number of lives. So the next time you hear the story of the P-38 Lightning, remember the nameless hands that shaped it. Remember the mud, the noise, the urgency, and the quiet courage of a man who believed a machine could be better. Because that's how history moves forward. One adjustment at a time. And in that truth lies the final lesson of war, that every innovation, no matter how small, carries within it the hope of survival. If you believe stories like this shouldn't be forgotten, join us. Subscribe for more untold histories, the ones that still hum quietly beneath the engines of time. The screen fades to black. The faint metallic hum of a P-38 lingers. And somewhere, across history, a single wire vibrates once more.